The grand ballroom of the Atherton Hotel glittered a universe of champagne flutes and hushed million-dollar deals. At its center was Elric Rowan, CEO of Titan Industries, a man who radiated success. Tonight he was set to announce the biggest merger of his career. But the real announcement, the one that would shatter the polished veneer of this opulent world, was poised on his lips. As he stood on the stage, a triumphant arm around his young, beautiful companion, he had no idea that his meticulously crafted empire was about to implode. Because across the room, watching from the shadows, was his ex-wife, Rosalie Marchmont. And she didn't just own his past, she owned the very ground he was standing on. The invitation had arrived a month prior, a thick cream-colored cardstock with embossed silver lettering that felt as weighty as the decision it carried. The annual Titan Industries Starlight Gala. It proclaimed a night to celebrate a decade of innovation and to look forward to a future of limitless potential. For most of the city's elite, it was the social event of the season. For Rosalie Marchmont, it was a summons to a life she had purposefully and painfully left behind. She'd almost thrown it away. The name Titan Industries was a brand on her soul, a permanent mark left by her ex-husband, Elric Rowan. Theirs had been a storybook romance, or so the magazines had said. A brilliant, ambitious young man, from a modest background, meets a woman with an inheritance that could launch 1,000 ships, or in their case, a global tech empire. Rosalie's family, the Marchmonts, had been old money, their wealth rooted in real estate and shrewd investments that spanned generations. They weren't flashy, but they were foundational to the city's very architecture. When Rosalie fell for Elric, her father, a man who could read a balance sheet like a poet reads verse, had been cautious. "He's hungry, Ellie." He'd warned her, his voice a low rumble in his mahogany-paneled study. "Make sure you're not what he's planning to eat." But Rosalie had been in love. She'd seen Elric's drive not as a threat, but as a thrilling force of nature. She'd believed in his vision, in the dazzling future he painted with such confident strokes. With her inheritance, a sizable portion of which she'd willingly invested as seed money, Titan Industries was born. For 15 years, they were an unstoppable team. Elric was the face, the charismatic genius who charmed investors and dominated boardrooms. Rosalie was the quiet, strategic mind behind the scenes, her inherited business acumen proving to be as valuable as her capital. She'd managed the company's real estate portfolio, acquiring properties with a foresight that had saved them millions and made them billions. The cracks, when they began to show, were hairline fractures in a seemingly perfect facade. Elric's business trips grew longer, his explanations vaguer. He became dismissive of her contributions publicly, referring to her as his supportive wife, while taking sole credit for the strategies she'd helped devise. The shared laughter in their sprawling mansion overlooking the bay dwindled, replaced by a tense silence that vibrated with unspoken resentments. Then came the discovery. A misplaced phone, a series of texts that were anything but professional. The other woman was younger, of course. A raven-haired, ambitious junior marketing associate named Wednesday Prescott. She was everything Rosalie was not overtly flirtatious, brazenly ambitious and unburdened by the quiet dignity of old money. The affair had been a swift, brutal affair, a cliché that felt no less devastating for its predictability. The divorce was quiet at Rosalie's insistence. She had no desire to see their shared history splashed across the tabloids. Elric, eager to avoid a financial bloodbath that could destabilize Titan, had agreed to a generous settlement. Or so he thought. He'd given her a lump sum, a few properties he deemed secondary, and had smugly assumed he'd kept the crown jewels. What he'd overlooked in his haste to move on to his new life with Wednesday was the complex web of trusts and holding companies through which Rosalie and her family owned a significant portion of the city's most valuable commercial real estate. Among them a portfolio that included the Atherton Hotel, the very venue for tonight's gala. It was an oversight born of arrogance, a belief that he had been the true architect of their success, and she merely the scaffolding. So here she was, standing in a secluded alcove of the grand ballroom, a ghost at her own feast. She'd chosen a deep sapphire gown, a stark contrast to the sea of glittering golds and silvers. Her honey-blonde hair was swept back in an elegant chignon, revealing the clean lines of her jaw and a pair of diamond earrings that had been her grandmother's. At 42, she was more beautiful than she had been in her youth, her face etched with a wisdom and a quiet strength that had been forged in the fires of betrayal. She watched as Elric worked the room Wednesday, clinging to his arm like a victory banner. He was in his element, a sun god dispensing warmth and light to his adoring acolytes. He hadn't aged a day, his dark hair still thick, his smile as blindingly white as ever. He was a master of performance, and tonight was his magnum opus. He was on the verge of acquiring a rival tech firm, a move that would solidify Titan's dominance for the next decade. The air was thick with anticipation, the buzz of speculation, a symphony of greed and admiration. Wednesday, in a crimson dress that left little to the imagination, was playing her part to perfection. She gazed at Elric with a doe-eyed adoration that made Rosalie's stomach churn. She was young enough to believe that his success was a reflection of her own worth, that his power was a cloak she could wrap herself in. She hadn't yet learned that Elric's love was a currency he spent only on himself. Rosalie. My God, is that you? Rosalie turned to see a familiar face, a man with a kind, weathered smile and a twinkle in his eye. It was Robert Chen, a senior partner at the law firm that had handled her family's affairs for decades. He was one of the few people who knew the true extent of her holdings. Robert, she said, her voice a little husky. I wasn't sure I'd see any friendly faces tonight. I'm surprised to see you here at all, he admitted, his gaze flicking towards Elric. Are you sure you're all right? I'm not sure, she confessed, a wry smile touching her lips. But I felt I needed to be here. To close a chapter, perhaps, or to start a new one, Robert suggested, his eyes holding hers with a knowing look. He knew about the Atherton. He'd been the one to finalize the paperwork years ago, a quiet acquisition made through a subsidiary that was so deeply buried in the Marchmont family trust that not even the most diligent of Elric's lawyers had flagged it. Before Rosalie could respond, a hush fell over the crowd. The lights dimmed, and a single spotlight illuminated the stage at the far end of the ballroom. Elric and Wednesday were making their way towards it, hand in hand. The moment had arrived. Rosalie felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She hadn't come here to make a scene. She had come to witness, to stand in the wreckage of her past and know that she had survived. She had come to see the culmination of the empire she had helped build, even if her name was no longer on the letterhead. But as she watched Elric step up to the podium, his face aglow with triumph, she felt a shift within her. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclamation. Elric tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the silent, cavernous space. Good evening, everyone. He began, his voice smooth and confident, the voice that had once whispered promises of forever in her ear. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate with us. It's been an incredible 10 years for Titan Industries. We've grown from a small startup with a big dream into a global leader in technology." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. Rosalie felt a jolt as his gaze seemed to snag on hers for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition, no flicker of surprise. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, a ghost he had long since exorcised. The thought was both a relief and a fresh wound. He continued his speech, a well-rehearsed litany of achievements and future projections. He spoke of the upcoming merger of the new frontiers they would conquer, of the legacy he was building. And then his tone shifted, becoming more personal, more intimate. "But my greatest success," he said, turning to Wednesday and taking her hand, "has not been in the boardroom. It's been in finding a partner who inspires me, who challenges me, and who makes every day a new adventure." He drew Wednesday closer, his arm circling her waist. The spotlight seemed to intensify, bathing them in an ethereal glow. The crowd leaned in their collective breath, held in anticipation. Rosalie's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what was coming. She had played this scene in her mind 100 times, a masochistic exercise in self-torture. But the reality of it, the public spectacle of it, was a fresh hell. And so Elric continued, his voice ringing with a sincerity that was utterly false. "I wanted to share another piece of wonderful news with you all tonight. This incredible woman has made me the happiest man in the world, and she has agreed to become my wife." He lifted Wednesday's left hand, and for the first time, Rosalie saw the massive diamond that adorned her finger. A rock so large it seemed to have its own gravitational pull. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, passionate kiss designed for maximum effect. The ballroom erupted in applause, a wave of sound that crashed over Rosalie, threatening to drown her. It was a perfect cinematic moment. A CEO at the pinnacle of his success, his beautiful young fiancée by his side, a future as bright and glittering as the champagne that flowed so freely. But Rosalie Marchmont was not drowning. As she watched the man who had taken everything from her, her love, her trust, her years, bask in the adulation of the crowd, a strange calm settled over her. The hurt was still there, a dull, throbbing ache deep within her chest. But it was now overlaid with something else, something cold and hard and sharp as a shard of glass. She thought of her father's words, "Make sure you're not what he's planning to eat." For years, she had been consumed by him, by his ambition, by his needs. He had feasted on her inheritance, on her intellect, on her love, and then discarded the bones. Tonight, Elric Rowan was celebrating on what he believed was his own turf. He was standing on the stage of his own triumph in a building he had chosen for its prestige and opulence. He thought he was the master of his universe. Rosalie took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, the bubbles fizzing on her tongue. The applause was beginning to die down, but the celebratory buzz remained. Robert Chen was looking at her, his expression a mixture of concern and something else. Anticipation. He knew. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. The chapter was not closing. A new one was indeed beginning. And Elric Rowan was about to find out that the foundation he had built his empire upon was not nearly as stable as he thought. In fact, he was standing on ground that belonged to the woman he had just erased from his history, and she was about to remind him that she owned the building. The applause finally subsided, leaving a residue of giddy excitement in the air. Elric kept Wednesday's hand held high, a triumphant gesture that milked the moment for all it was worth. He was a conductor, and this room of power brokers and socialites was his orchestra playing a symphony of his success. He looked out at the sea of faces, his smile unwavering, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He was assessing the impact of his announcement, gauging the reactions, ensuring that this personal triumph would translate into professional capital. This was Elric's way. Every moment, every relationship was a transaction. Wednesday was radiant, her face flushed with a mixture of love and adrenaline. She whispered something in Elric's ear, and he laughed, a deep, resonant sound that carried across the ballroom. To the world, they were the ultimate power couple, a perfect blend of influence and beauty. To Rosalie, they were a meticulously crafted illusion, a public relations campaign, masquerading as a love story. Rosalie remained in her alcove, a still point in the swirling chaos of celebration. People were beginning to move again, forming small clusters to dissect the news. The merger was now a secondary topic. The engagement was the real story. She could hear snippets of conversation floating past her. Did you know they were even engaged? She's stunning, but so young. That ring must have cost more than my house. Robert Chen moved closer to her, his presence a comforting anchor. Are you ready? He asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the din. Rosalie took a deep breath, the scent of expensive perfume and wilting flowers filling her lungs. I don't know if I'll ever be ready, Robert, she admitted. But it's time. The staff is on standby, he informed her. The hotel manager, Mr. Albright, is waiting for your signal. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the stage. Elric was now being swarmed by well-wishers, a king holding court. He was accepting handshakes and backpats, his arm still possessively around Wednesday's waist. He was untouchable, invincible. Or so he believed. Rosalie's plan had not been born of vengeance, not initially. It had been a defensive measure, a way to protect herself and her assets from the fallout of their divorce. But as the months had passed, as she'd watched Elric's star continue to rise, while her own contributions to his success were systematically erased, a quiet resolve had hardened within her. It was no longer just about protecting what was hers. It was about reclaiming her narrative. Tonight, Elric had not just announced his engagement, he had publicly declared her irrelevant. And that was a fiction she could no longer abide. She pulled out her phone, a sleek, minimalist device that was a stark contrast to the diamond-encrusted cases so popular in this crowd. With a few taps, she sent a single, pre-written message to Mr. Albright. Proceed. Across the ballroom, a man in an impeccably tailored tuxedo, his silver hair neatly combed, received the message. He gave a subtle nod to a uniformed security guard standing near the main entrance. The guard spoke into his wrist, and in the control room, deep within the hotel's bowels, a technician flipped a series of switches. The first indication that something was amiss was subtle. The music, a lively jazz ensemble that had been playing in the background, faltered and then died completely. The hum of the air conditioning system, a sound so ubiquitous that it had gone unnoticed, also ceased. A sudden, almost oppressive silence descended upon the ballroom. The crowd, which had been a cacophony of chatter and laughter, grew quiet. People looked around, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. A power outage at the Atherton unthinkable. The hotel was known for its seamless service, its flawless execution. Elric, who had been in the middle of a sentence, stopped talking. He frowned, his eyes scanning the room for an explanation. He was a man who craved control, and this unexpected interruption was an unwelcome intrusion into his perfectly orchestrated evening. Then the main lights in the ballroom, the massive crystal chandeliers that had dripped with light, flickered once, twice, and then went dark. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a wave of nervous laughter. For a moment, the The only light came from the emergency exit signs and the faint glow of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. But the darkness lasted only for a few seconds. A single spotlight, the same one that had illuminated Elric and Wednesday on stage, suddenly flared to life. But it was no longer pointed at the stage. It was now aimed at a different part of the room, at a secluded alcove where a woman in a sapphire gown stood, a champagne flute held loosely in her hand. Rosalie didn't flinch. She had anticipated this moment, had rehearsed it in her mind. But the reality of 200 pairs of eyes suddenly swiveling in her direction was still a shock to the system. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the intensity of their curiosity. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Who was she? What was happening? Elric's eyes, now accustomed to the dim light, found her. And this time there was a flicker of recognition. It was faint, confused, like trying to place a face from a long-forgotten dream. But it was there. He squinted, his head tilting slightly. Rosalie. It couldn't be. What was she doing here? And then a new voice filled the silence. It was calm, professional, and amplified by the hotel's integrated sound system, which had miraculously just come back to life. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the momentary interruption. There is a small technical issue which we are addressing. It was Mr. Albright, the hotel manager. He was now standing on the stage at the podium Elric had just vacated. He looked composed, authoritative. However, he continued, his voice resonating with a newfound gravity. We have a brief, unscheduled announcement to make. He paused, letting the suspense build. The spotlight remained fixed on Rosalie, who stood as still as a statue. Elric was now staring at her openly, his confusion rapidly turning to suspicion. His hand tightened on Wednesday's arm, a reflexive gesture of possession. Wednesday looked from Elric to Rosalie, her brow furrowed in a pretty perplexed frown. Tonight's gala is a celebration of Titan Industries, Mr. Albright said, his voice echoing in the silent room. And the Atherton Hotel is proud to host such a prestigious event. However, there seems to be a slight misunderstanding that we feel needs to be corrected. He looked directly at Elric, a man he had been deferring to all evening, and his expression was now unreadable, almost cold. Mr. Rowan, he said, his voice polite but firm. While we appreciate your patronage, we feel it is important to acknowledge the true owner of this establishment, a woman whose vision and commitment to excellence have made the Atherton the landmark that it is today. The spotlight on Rosalie seemed to intensify, bathing her in a brilliant, almost celestial light. She felt like an actress on a stage, the leading lady in a drama of her own making. Mr. Albright made a sweeping gesture towards her. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in acknowledging the owner of the Atherton Hotel, the president of the Marchmont Heritage Group, Ms. Rosalie Marchmont. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, a void, where the air had been sucked out of the room. 200 of the city's most powerful people were frozen in a state of collective shock, and then a single sound broke the silence. A soft, incredulous laugh. It came from Wednesday. She thought it was a joke, some kind of elaborate, tasteless prank. But one look at Elric's face told her it was not. His smile was gone, replaced by a mask of disbelief. His face, which had been flushed with triumph, was now a ghastly shade of white. His eyes were locked on Rosalie, and for the first time that night, he saw her. He truly saw her, not as the ghost of his past, but as a living, breathing force that had just hijacked his reality. The name Marchmont hung in the air, a name that had once been synonymous with his own success, a name he had carefully excised from the corporate history of Titan Industries, the Marchmont Heritage Group. He'd heard of it, of course, a powerhouse in commercial real estate, notoriously private, almost mythical in its influence. He had never made the connection. He had been so blinded by his own brilliance, so convinced of his own narrative, that he had failed to see the truth that was hiding in plain sight. The crowd began to stir, the initial shock giving way to a frantic, whispered exchange of information. People were pulling out their phones, their fingers flying across the screens as they Googled Rosalie Marchmont and Marchmont Heritage Group. The pieces were starting to click into place, and the picture they were forming was a stunning reversal of fortune. Rosalie finally moved. She lifted her chin, her expression serene, almost regale. She was no longer hiding in the shadows. She was bathed in light, the center of a universe that was rapidly reconfiguring itself around her. She took a step forward out of the alcove and into the main base of the ballroom. The crowd parted for her as if she were royalty, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and dawning respect. She was no longer just Elric Rowan's ex-wife. She was Rosalie Marchmont, the woman who owned the ground beneath their feet. Her eyes met Elric's across the crowded room. The shock on his face was now curdling into a dark, impotent rage. He had been a king in his castle, only to discover that the castle belonged to the queen he had banished. Rosalie gave him a small, enigmatic smile. It was not a smile of triumph or of malice. It was a smile of quiet, unassailable power, the kind of power he had always craved, but had never truly possessed. She then turned her attention to the woman standing beside him, the woman who was wearing a ring that had been bought with money, that had its roots in the Marchmont family fortune. Wednesday's face was a mess of confusion and dawning horror. The fairy tale was crumbling around her, the handsome prince revealed to be a fool, and the castle built on a foundation of lies. Rosalie's gaze lingered on her for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal lesson she was about to learn. And then she turned away her attention once again on the crowd, on the people who had come to celebrate her ex-husband's success. She raised her champagne flute, the crystal glinting in the spotlight. Her voice when she spoke was clear and steady, carrying across the silent room without the need for a microphone. "Welcome," she said, her voice laced with a subtle irony to my hotel. The echo of Rosalie's words, "Welcome to my hotel," resonated through the vast ballroom, not as a shout, but as a quiet, seismic shift that cracked the very foundations of the evening. It was a statement of simple fact delivered with the placid grace of a queen, and it landed with the devastating force of a declaration of war. For a long, suspended moment, there was only a cavernous silence, a collective intake of breath from 200 of the city's most influential figures. Then the silence shattered. Not into applause, but into a cacophony of sound, a surge of sharp, incredulous whispers, the rustle of silk and wool, as bodies shifted, turning towards each other with wide, questioning eyes. The air, once thick with champagne-fueled celebration, was now charged with the electric hum of scandal. The click and glow of smartphones being unlocked became a sound in itself, a digital wildfire as guests frantically searched for the connection between Rosalie Marchmont and the Marchmont Heritage Group. The city's elite, a class of people who prided themselves on knowing everything about everyone, were caught in a vortex of information they hadn't possessed moments before, and their hunger for it was voracious. On the stage which had been his throne of triumph, Elric stood as if flash-frozen. The spotlight felt less like a celebration and more like an accusation. His face, which had been a mask of confident charm, was now a ghastly white canvas on which disbelief and fury waged a violent war. His mind, usually sharp and several steps ahead, was struggling to catch up. Marchmont, the Marchmont Heritage Group. He knew the name, of course. A quiet, almost mythical giant in commercial real estate, notoriously private, their holdings woven into the very fabric of the city. He'd never once made the connection. He had been so consumed by his own narrative, so blinded by the brilliance of the empire he believed he had built alone, that he had failed to see the name that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, the bedrock beneath his feet. Beside him, Wednesday made a soft, choking sound. The fairy tale had dissolved into a nightmare with terrifying speed. She looked from Elric's stunned face to the woman in sapphire, and the pieces began to click into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't a bitter ex-wife. This was a formidable power. The pitying glances she now felt from the crowd were like tiny, sharp needles against her skin. She had been the prize, the symbol of Elric's new life. Now she was just the fool, standing next to the Emperor, who had just been revealed to have no clothes. She took an involuntary half-step away from him, a small, telling gesture of self-preservation that did not go unnoticed. Rosalie, meanwhile, was the calm at the center of the storm she had unleashed. She gave a near imperceptible nod to Robert Chen, who stood by her side, a silent sentinel. Then she moved. She stepped out from the relative obscurity of her alcove and began to walk, her pace unhurried, her posture radiating a composure that was its own form of power. It was a masterful play. She wasn't fleeing the chaos. She was commanding it, forcing every eye to follow her as she advanced. The crowd, a dense sea of black tie and couture, parted for her, instinctively the way water parts for the bow of a ship. There was a new deference in their eyes, a dawning awe. She was no longer a ghost from Elric's past. She was a revelation. Her path was a direct line to the stage, a slow, deliberate march toward the man who had discarded her. With every step she took, the tension in the room coiled tighter. The air vibrated with anticipation. This was no longer a corporate announcement. It was a personal reckoning, and everyone in the room had a front-row seat. Elric watched her approach. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. The sight of her, so serene, so utterly in control of the situation, stoked the flames of his rage. She was supposed to be a footnote in his biography, a vanquished memory. Instead, she had just become the headline. His survival instincts screamed at him. He was a fighter. He had clawed his way to the top and had never backed down. He would not start now. As Rosalie reached the foot of the stage, she paused, tilting her head back slightly to look up at him. The raised platform, which he had chosen to amplify his presence, now served only to isolate him, making him a target on a pedestal. Rosalie. He finally ground out his voice, a low, dangerous growl that was meant to intimidate. What is the meaning of this? I believe Mr. Albright was quite clear. She replied, her voice cool and even, carrying easily in the tense silence. She did not raise it. She didn't need to. Every ear was straining to hear. I own this hotel. She let the statement settle for a beat before adding the final devastating stroke. And you, Elric, are a guest. She imbued the word guest with a universe of meaning. It redefined him. He was not the host, not the master, not the king. He was merely present at her sufferance. The raw insult was too much for Wednesday. Her own humiliation, her own terror needed a target, and the woman before her was it. She found her voice, though it was shrill and unsteady. You have no right. This is our night, our celebration. You're just a bitter, jealous ex-wife, trying to ruin everything because he chose me." It was a desperate, clumsy attack, and Rosalie met it not with anger, but with a gaze that held a universe of weary pity. It was the look of a woman who had already fought and won this war years ago, in the silent desolation of her own heart. "My dear," she said, her voice softening with a condescension that was far more cutting than any shout. A piece of unsolicited advice from one woman to another. "Before you agree to marry a man, you should really do your due diligence." Her eyes flickered to the ostentatious diamond on Wednesday's finger, then back to her face. A lesson I learned far too late. "You see some assets," she continued, her words precise and devastating, "come with liabilities you can't see on the balance sheet." Wednesday flinched, as if she'd been physically struck, her face paling. The insult delivered in the cold, impersonal language of their world had found its mark. Elric's control finally snapped. The humiliation was absolute, the challenge to his authority undeniable. "Get out!" he seethed, taking an aggressive step to the edge of the stage, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists. He pointed a trembling finger at Rosalie. "This is my event. This is a Titan Industries gala. I paid for this ballroom." He played his trump card, his voice rising with a self-righteous fury. A low gasp rippled through the onlookers. The confrontation had devolved into a raw, ugly dispute over a bill. But Rosalie didn't even flinch. She simply held his gaze, a flicker of something almost amused in her eyes. Then she shifted her attention past him to the man standing frozen at the podium. "Mr. Albright." She called out, her voice a model of professional decorum. "Perhaps you could clarify the booking arrangements for Mr. Rowan." Mr. Albright, who had been waiting for his cue, straightened his tie. He looked down at Elric with an expression of polite, professional regret. "Certainly, Ms. Marchmont." He turned back to the microphone, his voice amplified throughout the room, each word a nail in Elric's coffin. While Titan Industries did indeed make a booking for the grand ballroom tonight, that booking was made with the hotel's previous ownership group. As of the first of this quarter, all outstanding event contracts were transferred to the new management under the purview of the Marchmont Heritage Group. He paused, allowing the legalistic explanation to sink in, stripping Elric of his one claim. Then came the final exquisite twist of the knife. As a gesture of goodwill to a prominent member of the city's business community, he continued looking directly at Elric. "Miss Marchmont graciously instructed us to honor the event under its original terms." He lifted a folder from the podium, which I might add included a significant professional courtesy discount. A wave of stifled laughter and shocked murmurs swept the ballroom. The humiliation was now breathtaking in its completeness. Elric Rowan wasn't just a guest. He was a discount guest. He was at his own coronation on a coupon provided by the ex-wife he had tried to erase. The story was now legend. Elric's face was a thundercloud of impotent fury. He had been played outmaneuvered at every turn publicly and expertly. His rage turned inward, a venomous snarling thing in his chest. "This is not over." "Rosalie," he snarled, his voice a low hiss meant only for her. It was a promise, a threat. Rosalie stepped closer to the stage, looking up at him, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I know," she replied, her voice equally quiet, a calm sea that hid unfathomable depths. "It's just getting started." She paused, a final, perfectly timed beat. "I believe we have a board meeting for the new acquisition on Monday morning. I was so pleased to see the merger go through." Elric stared at her, uncomprehending. What was she talking about? "I'll be there, of course," she continued, as if discussing the weather. "As a major shareholder in the company you just acquired, I feel it's important I take a more active role in its future." And there it was, the checkmate. The final devastating blow he never saw coming. It wasn't just about the hotel. While he was planning his gala, his victory party, she had been quietly, ruthlessly buying up a controlling interest in his prize. She hadn't just taken back the stage. She had infiltrated his castle. The rage on Elric's face dissolved, replaced by something he hadn't felt since he was a penniless young man, with nothing but ambition, raw, chilling fear. He had seen her as sentimental, soft, an obstacle he had overcome long ago. He had never once seen her as a strategist, a predator. He had fatally underestimated her, and he was only now beginning to understand the price of that mistake. Rosalie held his gaze for one last long moment. It was a look that encompassed 15 years of shared history, of love and betrayal, of pain and rebirth. It was a look of finality. Then she turned her back on him. She turned her back on the stage, on the wreckage of his life, on the woman who had replaced her, and she walked away. The crowd parted for her again, but this time the awe was mixed with a palpable fear and respect. She was not Elric Rowan's ex-wife. She was Rosalie Marchmont, and she was a force to be reckoned with. As she reached the grand archway of the ballroom, she allowed herself a brief final glance over her shoulder. The spotlight was still on the stage, illuminating Elric and Wednesday, two figures trapped and isolated in the glare of their public ruin. The triumphant applause was a distant, mocking echo. The rest of the glittering world was just shadows and whispers. She had come tonight to witness the end of a chapter. Instead, she had seized the pen and written a beginning. Her beginning. And as she stepped out of the ballroom and into the cool, quiet promise of the night, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the story was finally hers. The morning after the Starlight Gala, Elric Rowan woke to a silence that was more damning than any accusation. The cavernous bedroom of his sterile, modernist mansion was usually filled with the low hum of Market Watch channels or the cheerful chatter of Wednesday making coffee. Today, there was nothing. The sun streaming through the vast, unadorned windows felt intrusive, painfully bright. He felt a throbbing behind his eyes that had nothing to do with champagne and everything to do with the utter public demolition of his world. His phone lying on the marble nightstand was a dark mirror reflecting his pale, drawn face. He dreaded touching it, knowing it was a Pandora's box of digital condemnation. When he finally did, the screen lit up with a deluge of notifications, dozens of missed calls, hundreds of unread messages, and a news alert that made his stomach clench. It was from the Wall Street Journal, the headline stark and brutal. Titan's throne, Shaken Rowan's ex-wife, revealed as landlord and key shareholder in hostile power play. The story was everywhere. It wasn't just a juicy piece of gossip for the society pages. It was a lead story on every major financial news outlet. The Titan and the Ghost One popular blog had dubbed them. Another more pointedly asked Rowan's empire, built on Marchmont's foundation. The narrative he had spent a decade and a half meticulously crafting, that of the self-made genius, the visionary who had built an empire from scratch, had been irrevocably rewritten overnight. He was now a caricature, the arrogant husband who had ridden his wife's coattails, discarded her, and then been foolish enough to celebrate his new life on her property. The frantic calls began. First to his lead counsel, a man whose usual swagger was replaced by a stammering unease. Then to his head of P, who spoke in funereal tones about damage control and reframing the narrative, hollow phrases that offered no comfort. The investors, the ones he had personally courted and won over with his charisma, were next. Their voices were tight with a new, chilling politeness, their questions sharp. How could he have been unaware of such a significant asset transfer? What other liabilities were hidden from the board? His assurances sounded weak, desperate even to his own ears. He had built his kingdom on the perception of infallibility. That perception had been shattered. His personal life imploded with equal swiftness. Wednesday emerged from the guest wing, her face puffy from crying, her crimson gala dress from the night before now looking like a cheap costume. The fairy tale was over. "They're calling me a gold digger," she said, her voice thin and brittle. "A home wrecker who got played. Do you know how humiliating that is? Do you think this is about you?" Elric snapped the pressure inside him, erupting. "My entire company, my life's work, is on the line because of her." "You lied to me, Elric." She shot back the doe-eyed adoration of the previous night, replaced by a hard, resentful glare. "You let me stand on that stage and look like a fool. You told me she was nobody, a relic from your past. It turns out she's the one who owns everything." The massive diamond on her finger seemed to mock her. It wasn't a key to a kingdom. It was a souvenir from a failed coup. The argument was short and ugly, stripping away the last vestiges of their glamorous illusion. It was a transaction that had soured, and both parties wanted out. Within the week, Wednesday was gone. The ring sat in its velvet box on Elric's dresser, a multi-million-dollar monument to his hubris. The silence in the mansion returned heavier and more permanent this time. He was alone with the consequences of his own arrogance. While Elric's world imploded, Rosalie's expanded with a quiet, deliberate focus. She worked not from a war room, but from the serene, book-lined study of her family's townhouse, the same room where her father had once taught her about long-term value over short-term gain. She refused all requests for interviews, letting the facts as they had been so publicly revealed speak for themselves. Her power was not in what she said, but in what she owned and what she was now meticulously planning to do. "He'll come to the board meeting with an army of lawyers," Robert Chen warned, looking over a stack of corporate bylaws. "He'll try to paint you as vindictive, emotionally compromised." Rosalie looked up from a set of architectural blueprints spread across the grand mahogany desk. "That's why I'm not coming with lawyers, Robert. I'm coming with a better plan." She tapped a section of the blueprints. "Elric thinks in terms of acquisitions and hostile takeovers. He sees business as a battlefield. I see it as an ecosystem. He wants to conquer. I intend to cultivate." Her preparation was relentless. For days, she and a small, trusted team of the country's top financial and logistical analysts dissected the merged companies. They found redundancies. Elric had missed opportunities he had dismissed. Her vision was holistic, integrating the Marchmont Heritage Group's real estate assets with Titan's technological prowess. It was audacious, innovative, and most importantly, undeniably profitable. She wasn't preparing for a fight. She was preparing to govern. The atmosphere in the Titan Industries boardroom on the day of the first meeting was electric with tension. The long, polished table felt like a dueling ground. The board members, a collection of pragmatic, powerful individuals, sat with stony expressions, their allegiances uncertain. They had come to witness a soap opera. They were about to decide the future of a multi-billion-dollar empire. Elric arrived, flanked by his legal team. his face set in a grim mask of defiance. He looked every inch the cornered predator ready to lash out. He spoke first, his voice tight with controlled fury. He spoke of fiduciary duty, of shareholder disruption, and launched into a thinly veiled attack on Rosalie's motives, painting her as a scorned woman, seeking personal revenge at the company's expense. Then it was Rosalie's turn. She walked to the head of the table alone, projecting an aura of calm that was more intimidating than any army of lawyers. She carried no binders of legal threats, only a slim tablet. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice even and clear, resonating with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "Mr. Rowan is correct that our duty is to our shareholders, and that is precisely why I am here." What followed was a masterclass in corporate strategy. She did not mention her personal history with Elric. She did not speak of betrayal or humiliation. She spoke of synergy, of innovation, of sustainable growth. She presented a detailed, data-driven vision for the newly expanded Titan Industries. She showed them blueprints for new state-of-the-art tech campuses built on VHG-owned land, slashing long-term operational costs. She laid out a plan for diversifying into emerging markets, backed by VHG's international real estate holdings. And she spoke of creating a corporate culture that valued collaboration and integrity, a quiet, devastating critique of Elric's autocratic reign. She dismantled Elric's proposed strategy not with attacks, but with superior logic and more compelling numbers. The board, who had braced for a messy personal war, listened with growing fascination, then dawning respect. They saw in Rosalie not a bitter ex-wife, but a shrewd, formidable leader. They saw a future for the company that was more stable, more ambitious, and ultimately more lucrative. When she finished, the silence in the room was profound. It was the silence of a paradigm shifting. The vote was a mere formality. Rosalie's plan was adopted, and in a move that sealed Elric's fate, she was nominated and elected as the new chairwoman of the board. He was not fired. That would have been too clean, too merciful. Instead, he was neutered. He kept the title of CEO, the corner office, the extravagant salary. But his power was gone, his authority subject to the approval of the woman he had tried to destroy. He was a figurehead forced to sit in his gilded cage and execute a vision that was not his every move overseen by the board that Rosalie now commanded. He was a ghost in his own machine. In the year that followed, Rosalie's revolution was quiet but total. The culture at Titan changed. The fear-based sycophancy that had defined Elric's tenure was replaced by a new energy of innovation and collaboration. She was a constant presence, not as an overlord, but as a guiding force. Her business acumen, so long suppressed and undervalued, now flourished in the light. She was lauded in the business press as a visionary. One evening, a year after the gala, Rosalie stood in her office, the penthouse suite of the Atherton Hotel that she had claimed as the new VHG headquarters. The view of the city was breathtaking, a glittering tapestry of lights. She now saw not just as a landscape, but as a portfolio. There was a soft knock. Robert Chen entered, holding a single, long-stemmed white rose. "This was left for you at the front desk, Rosalie," he said, a knowing smile on his face. "No card." Rosalie took the rose, its petals flawless. It was not a plea for forgiveness or a declaration of love. It was a white flag, a silent, unconditional surrender from a defeated king, a final bitter acknowledgement that she had won. She placed it in a simple crystal vase on her desk, its solitary elegance a quiet testament to her victory. She hadn't needed to scream or to exact a petty public revenge. She had simply reclaimed what was hers, her history, her legacy, her name. She looked out at the glittering city, her city, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The past was no longer a wound. It was a foundation. And she, Rosalie Marchmont, was the architect. And there you have it, a story of betrayal, resilience, and the ultimate reclamation of power. Rosalie Marchmont's journey reminds us that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful, and that underestimating someone can be the most costly mistake of all. It's a testament to the fact that true strength isn't about public declarations, but about the solid foundations you build both in business and in life. If you were captivated by Rosalie's story and the dramatic implosion of Elric's world, please let me know in the comments below. What was your favorite twist? Who do you think was the ultimate winner in this corporate chess game? Don't forget to hit that like button. If you enjoyed this video, share it with someone who loves a good story of triumph, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales of drama, intrigue, and poetic justice. Your support means the world to us and ensures we can keep bringing these stories to you. Thanks for listening.